Welcome to Shoot Like a Girl, a podcast featuring military women from around the world who push their limits on and off duty. I'm your host, Kate Stewart, and this is episode number 20. This episode is a reading from the book 15 Days by Christie Blatchford. Captain Nichola Kathleen Sarah Goddard, MSM, born May 2nd, 1980, died May 17th, 2006, was the first female Canadian combat soldier killed in combat and the 16th Canadian soldier killed in Canadian operations in Afghanistan. Nicola's story really inspired me early in my career, and as I learned more about her, I realized what a role model she was to all those around her. I believe all Canadian Forces members and members of the public should learn her story.
Steady, steady, nice and steady. Light, hill, cover. I'm a steamroller, baby.
I'm a steamroller, baby.
Just a rolling down the line.
Just a rolling down the line.
I'm a steamroller, baby.
I'm a steamroller, baby.
Just a rolling down the line.
Just a rolling down the line.
So you better get out of my way now.
So you better get out of my way now.
Or I roll all over you.
Before I roll all over you.
May 17th was shaping up as a huge day for Nichola Kathleen Sarah Goddard, Forward Observation Officer. FOOs are the artillery officers at the front end of the front lines. Their job is to watch the enemy in its positions so that they can call in and coordinate the big artillery guns, 81mm mortars, and attack helicopters. As a former gunner, retired Colonel Mike Capstick once told me, "You can't engage stuff you can't see. You have to know what you're shooting at, and to do that, you have to expose yourself." More poetically, Capstick says the FOO is the orchestra director, the person who decides which weapon system is best for the job and orchestrates its delivery in concert with the maneuver force. As a result, the FOO's job is considered to be one of the most dangerous jobs in the artillery, and among the most dangerous in the entire Army. It has always been that way. Steve Gallagher, Goddard's battery commander, remembers going to Vimy Ridge, the site of the most storied victory in Canadian military history. Already steeped in gunner lore, they were nonetheless struck by how many of the 7,000 Canadians buried in the immaculate graves of the 30 war cemeteries within 15 kilometers of the Vimy Memorial were artillery, almost all of whom were FOOs. The 1st Regiment Royal Canadian Horse Artillery is the oldest unit of the Canadian Forces, the descendant of the original batteries of artillery that were formed in 1871, when guns were carried about by horse-drawn carriage. In Kandahar, its A battery had 3 FOOs, each of whom was attached to a particular infantry company. Goddard with Charlie, and Major Bill Fletcher and Mike Smith with Bravo, and Major Nick Grimshaw and Bob Meade with Alpha's Kirk Gallinger. In May, the battle group's main effort was still up north, so Meade was at Fob Martello, then brand new, and Smith was at the Gumbad Patrol House. With Bravo Company under Acting OC Jay Adair slated to go into the Panjway area, Goddard was the only FOO readily available. Originally, the company was supposed to head further south to a village on the Arghandab River called Kadahal, Adair says. But as they were approaching it, Ian Hope got on the radio and told them to turn back to a place called Pajmol, where local intelligence said the Taliban were massing. That morning, Hope remembers, the people in Bayanzi village complained to the local Afghan National Police in Bazar-e-Panjway that Taliban had slept in the school and turned children away. This was the same white school where so much Canadian blood would be spilled. But at that time, neither it nor Pajmol, which isn't a single entity, but a series of villages and compounds, were particularly well known. The troops turned around and headed back toward Bazar-e-Panjway. As they crossed the Arghandab River, they saw a large number of women and children fleeing, the usual harbinger of the Taliban preparing to make a stand and fight. Goddard, whose call sign was Golf 13, was attached to Captain Conrad von Finkenstein's 5 platoon. By 11 a.m., she had already called in the 1st Artillery firing in direct support of troops in contact. She was the first FOO to call in bullets since Korea, Gallagher says, using the term bullets, as gunners invariably do, for the enormous shells fired by the M777 howitzer. With a diameter of 155 millimeters, or about 6 inches, and weighing in at between 43 and 46 kilograms, or 95 and 100 pounds, they're not bullets as most people know them. Not the first woman, Gallagher says, the first FOO, and she was ecstatic. Or, as Adair puts it, She was enthusiastic, but still calm. It was not the first time the M777s had fired in support of operations. That had happened early in February, when the Gumbad platoon house was attacked by RPGs, and again in support of Fletcher and Charlie Company when they were in Helmand Province. But it was the first fire mission in support of soldiers who were actually under fire. In this case, John Snyder's 8th Platoon, who were attacked from Haji Musa about 800 meters west of the White School. The first mission was quickly cancelled, and Goddard called in U.S. Apache attack helicopters. FOOs can call in attack helicopters, which inexplicably aren't classified as close air, though they can certainly come in close and low. However, the range of fixed-wing aircraft are instead handled by forward air controllers. That afternoon, Adair says, Nick was doing two things, controlling Apaches very effectively and calling in the artillery. Then things seemed to slow down, Adair remembers. Throughout the afternoon, we were playing this cat and mouse game. We had a little bit of contact, but nothing serious. Later still, the troops were able to search the area where they found at least a dozen Taliban hiding in the grape fields. You'd look down a vineyard and see their feet, Adair says, and they'd hidden their weapons, and you'd drag them out. They also searched the nearby compounds and found firing positions, weapons, blood trails, and 30 bags of nitrate fertilizer. As all this was coming to a close, gunfire suddenly erupted along a frontage of 1,200 meters, a coordinated enemy attack that ambushed von Finkenstein's platoon and Goddard as they were preparing to move south. Goddard was in the turret, in the right-hand seat, her head up even higher than usual as she directed the LAV to back up along a narrow road. Master Bombardier Jeff Fair was beside her in the left-hand seat. He says he saw a big white flash, and he was knocked down into his seat, and he got on the cannon and started wailing with a 25mm cannon. The cannon jammed from the dent, so he went to the coaxial machine gun, mounted on the same axis as the 25mm cannon, and that jammed too. So he hopped on the machine gun, and that's when he looked over and saw Nick slump down. The LAV had been hit with RPGs at the front and rear left side. Shrapnel had torn into the back of Goddard's head. Immediately over the radio, Adair says, I hear, "This is Golf 1-3, my sunray's down." Sunray is a generic term that means commander, either a platoon or company commander. FOOs are the commanders of their LAVs. Gallagher was sitting on the highest hill in the area with Ian Hope. The last thing I heard her say on the radio was, "I'm just backing up, we've got some ANA behind us. I'm going to get turned around," Gallagher says. He remembers hearing Fair say only, 1-3, Sunray's been hit. He didn't say Golf 1-3, he just said 1-3. I could hear Colonel Hope talking to himself on the radio, saying, slow down, slow down. I knew the only 1-3 was Golf 1-3. Adair knew only that Goddard was down. I don't know she's dead, he says. We race over, we now recognize that this platoon and her have been ambushed, and we have to somehow get them out. I have to make a decision very quickly, have to decide, do I go up and get them on that narrow road, or do I fire to their flanks and suppress and have them come back? Adair stayed put, his troops laying down suppressing fire so the others could clear the area. It was the worst feeling ever, he says, because there was panic on the radio. It's getting dark. There's lots of smoke, lots of noise, and quite frankly, I don't know if I've made the right decision. I see people running and jumping onto the sides of vehicles just to get out of there. It was crazy. The troops pulled back to the White School, 5 platoon the last to arrive. They'd reported they had casualties, Adair says, but they were back and could account for everyone. Then Nicola's vehicle came back. We got her out, and she was dead. Hope had heard that there was a priority 4 casualty, then that the casualty was vital signs absent. Then I was given the ZAP number, he says, the 4-digit code that allows soldiers to identify casualties without naming names on the air. He always carried with him a list of his soldiers, about 6 typed pages, with each soldier's ZAP. He walked over to Gallagher and Battery Sergeant Major Paul Parsons and told them it was Goddard. Tears flowed instantly in their eyes, Hope says. He got the grid references for the Taliban group that had ambushed Goddard and 5 platoon and called in the second fire mission of the day. It was followed quickly by a 1,000-pound bomb dropped by a B-1. The troops couldn't return to the area until the next morning, by which time the Taliban had done a thorough job of policing up their dead and wounded. But Hope remembers that we had evidence, numbers of blood trails, body parts, and witnesses of the enemy being hit to suggest that between 20 and 25 Taliban were killed or wounded that day. Another 32 were detained by the ANA. I knew it was Nick before they told me, Hope says. I knew because on all ops up to that point, Nick was a constant on the radio, giving me incredible detail about what was happening and coordinating all the artillery, air, and other support assets. That evening, her silence warned me of her fall before I was told. The next day, caught in yet another tick, Ian Hope was bereft. There was no one to give me my sit reps, he says. She could synthesize everything. In early April 2006, the reporters embedded with Charlie Company heard Nick Goddard over the radio. She was with Bill Fletcher, as usual. On a 24-hour trip to Fob Robinson, about 100 kilometers north of Kandahar, it was her voice we heard most often. It was a hellish trip. Almost everything that could go wrong, short of an attack or bomb, did. Vehicles broke down or got stuck. A suicide bomber tried desperately to make his way through the ruined Kandahar streets to get to the convoy. And to cap it all off, a civilian truck sideswiped the lab I was in, spinning the 25mm cannon to squarely whack and badly injure the two young air sentries standing in the rear open hatches. One of them, Private Daniel Malo, bloodied and moaning, tumbled back through the hatch into the lab and almost into my lap. Both he and Private Dawson Bayless had to be choppered out. By the time we got to the fob, a naked patch of powdery desert ringed by a row of HESCO bastions, the container system that looks from a distance like ordinary sandbags but is more durable and much stronger, the sun was coming up. Exhausted, nerves frayed, we all dropped to the sand by our labs to grab a little sleep. The soldiers were there to secure the base, where just a few days before, one of their own, Private Rob Costal, as well as a U.S. Army Sergeant, John Thomas Stone, a medic, had been killed in a fierce three-sided Taliban attack. When we awoke around 10 a.m., already drenched in perspiration from the heat of the spring sun, Fletcher agreed to show us the area where the battle had taken place. As we walked over, the first question Rosie DiMano of the Toronto Star and I asked, almost in unison, was, "Who was that woman on the radio last night?" We had been in different labs for the long trip, but both of us had been comforted by the sound of her voice. So calm. I distinctly remember thinking that as long as her voice didn't quaver or rise in inflection, nothing really awful was happening. "Oh, that's Captain Nick," Fletcher replied with his trademark lopsided grin. "She was fabulous," he said. He'd prefer never to go anywhere without her. Much later, months after her death, he told me, "She was my FOO, so she was always right beside me. And she was phenomenally good at what she did, to the point where we leaned on her pretty heavily." Her death was real hard on the fellows. As it turned out, DiMano and I, the Globe photographer, and another journalist were all choppered out of the base within the hour on General Fraser's orders. We weren't around long enough to meet Goddard. Rosie and I would have sought her out, I think, if only to thank her, and to meet one of the few women we'd encountered in the combat arms end. The artillery wasn't Goddard's first choice, says her husband Jason, or Jay Beam. Recruits joining the military are given a list of jobs and asked to select their top 6. I'm not sure if they do this still, Beam says, but back when we joined, a common sales pitch at the recruiting center was that if you liked the outdoors and things like camping, then you'd love the infantry. Nichola thought this was a good choice and put infantry down as her first choice, with artillery as her second. When she was accepted at the Royal Military College, or RMC, in Kingston, Ontario, she got her second choice and was enrolled as an artillery officer. At the time, Beam says, she had no idea what the differences between infantry and artillery were, but eventually was very happy that she was a gunner. Beam and Goddard met during the first week of basic training at Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu near Montreal in June 1998. One of the things recruits had to master was assembling the various bits of their kit. They'd be sent running down the long halls to get their boots and then be shown how to lace them. It was during one such mad dash that Goddard introduced herself. "Goddard," she said. "I'm Beam," he replied, clueless in the way of young men that she might be interested in him. They were in the same platoon, her room across the hall from his. Though they became friends right away, he was sufficiently blind to the signals she was sending out that she finally had to sit him down and squarely raise the subject of their dating. As her father, Dr. Tim Goddard, put it at her funeral, Dear Jay, she knew right away that he was the one. 3 weeks after Goddard and Beam met, they were a couple, and they dated throughout their 4 years at RMC, marrying on December 28, 2002 in the same Calgary church where her funeral was held. Beam is a thoughtful and cheerful young man, a self-described computer geek born and raised in Niagara Falls, Ontario, whose parents divorced when he was a teenager. He joined Army cadets at the age of 12 and was so sure the military life was for him that RMC was the only university he applied to and wanted to attend. During a mandatory training course, while attacking a hill, he dislocated his right kneecap. It was the 12th time in 4 years he dislocated it, and finally in the spring of 2001 he had surgery. It was successful in that Beam hadn't dislocated his knee since, but he couldn't run anymore. The operation launched him down a long road of physiotherapy and specialist appointments. He and Goddard graduated in 2002, Beam with a degree in software engineering, she on the dean's list with an English degree. While he stayed behind at RMC, working as a lab assistant in the school's electrical and computer engineering department and waiting for the first round of medical paperwork to go through, Goddard was commissioned as a second lieutenant, sent to Gagetown for specialty artillery training, and then posted to 1 RCHA in Shiloh, Manitoba as the gun position officer. When Beam was ruled unfit for the Army and it appeared that he was headed for a career as an air traffic controller, he was posted to Winnipeg, a 2-hour drive from Shiloh. He was due to start the ATC course when someone noticed on his paperwork that he couldn't run and wouldn't be able to complete the mandatory physical training test. According to the universality of service, everyone needs to be able to fight as an infantry soldier, regardless of their trade, so the paperwork for a medical review was restarted. Everyone thinks it's kind of funny that I need to be able to run in order to be an ATC, Beam says. I joked that I'd need to be able to run to grab a fresh coffee between planes landing. Only in the spring of 2004, when it was clear he would be let go from the forces because of his knee, was he posted to Shiloh to wait out his release. After 7 years of trying to make the military work for him, his medical release finally went through in November 2005. He is remarkably without bitterness or regret. People have often asked if I miss the military life, or if I wished I was still in. My views are that it isn't an option at all, he says, with a very pragmatism that would have served him so well in the Army, so I don't really think about it or miss it. I enjoyed my time in the forces and was sad to leave, but that was just the way things were. Major Ann Reifenstein had just taken over as A Battery Commander when Goddard arrived in Shiloh in August 2002. Almost immediately, the battery was out on exercise and the two officers shared a tent. We just clicked, Reifenstein says. I'm her boss, and it's not a small separation. It's fairly significant, but it was so easy. We must have spent an hour and a half just laughing inside the tent. Finally, Goddard said, "Ma'am, we have to stop," aware that the men would think they were laughing at them. Almost 15 years older than Goddard, Reifenstein joined the military in 1989 after dropping out of university. She was one of the first of the new wave of young women full of piss and vinegar, convinced they could do anything and everything. The one thing she was sure she didn't want to do was be a loggy, a logistics officer, because that's what women so often did in the forces. In those days, there was something called the Combat Arms Officer Selection Boards, where in Gagetown for a week, recruits got to see firsthand what each of the trades did. Reifenstein saw the infantry, as she puts it with a grin, attacking the top of a hill, as they always do. Her brother is a tanker with Lord Strathcona's horse, and she thought that being a tanker would be fun until she saw the confined inside of one for the first time. It stunk of dirty socks, she says, no way. And then she saw the guns fire, thought it magic, and made her decision. After that first brave group of which she was a part, Reifenstein says, there weren't any more women officers for a long, long time. I sang solo for a lot of years. Yet finally, there before her in Shiloh was a smart, switched-on, charismatic young woman. She had everything, Reifenstein says of Goddard, but I'll tell you the one thing she didn't have, and it's unusual for female officers. I have one. She didn't have a chip on her shoulder. That chip is nothing you ever want or cultivate, Reifenstein says, but as one of a handful of women in the band of brothers, it just develops. It comes from the constant, gnawing need to prove you can beat a man at the game. And there was Goddard, so at ease in her own skin and so damn nice. And she saw the military as a worthwhile career option. It proved a point to me in my head. Yes, it was worth it. All those years wondering if I'm just blowing smoke. I opened the door to people like Nichola coming in, so that was really good. It's one of the main reasons Reifenstein thinks why Goddard's death hit her so hard. Another is that they were major and junior, boss and rookie, and that meant she died before we could be friends. I'm always going to regret that. The gun position officer, or GPO, is a big job in an artillery battery. Responsible for the firing of the guns and the attendant logistics support, the GPO works with about 60 soldiers and 2 or 3 other officers. When things go for a dump on the gun line, Reifenstein says, the battery commander calls for the GPO to explain the situation. In my case, it usually involved a lot of profanity, both as a BC and muffled under my breath when I was a GPO. The job is done at a frantic pace, and it is perfect for the sort of people who overcommit themselves, complain about it, and then do it again and again. Goddard didn't complain, at least not to Reifenstein, but she was really good at it. I ran her ragged, and she was great. I pushed her really hard. I pushed most of my officers really hard. There are generals who squished me too, to get the most possible out of me. They had a lot of fun, too, and had a superb crew, Reifenstein says. Every day, they'd gather at the front counter in the battery and inhale gummy bears and tell stories, Goddard contributing long, convoluted ones about her and Jay's 2 mangy and enormous mutts, Sam and Bill. I miss it terribly, says Reifenstein, now the chief instructor at RMC. Once, when she gave Goddard extra duties, there'd been a screw-up on the gun line, and, as the GPO, she was responsible. So in the end, she bore the punishment. Almost every senior NCO and the warrant officer himself came to Reifenstein's office to plead Goddard's case. She didn't change her mind. Extra duties build character and make you a better judge of when to hand them out if you've done some yourself, Reifenstein says. But it was a measure of the sort of rapport Goddard had struck with her men. In the spring of 2005, with Afghanistan on the radar, Reifenstein knew her young charge was ready to move on. She had planned major exercises, fired the guns on tricky and complex fire plans, and proven that she understood artillery fire from the gun line end. Goddard was promoted to captain and began her FOO course. It's a very different job with very different demands. The FOO's life is less hectic, akin to the fireman's, with incredible bursts of adrenaline punctuating long stretches of quiet. A FOO has multiple masters, from the battery commander to the infantry company commander, and competing loyalties, and lives cheek by jowl with a crew of 4, sergeant, gunner, signaller, and driver. It's a closer, more involved relationship with your crew, and one I'll be the first to admit I never mastered, Reifenstein says. Goddard made productive use even of the downtime common to garrison-bound FOO. Whereas Reifenstein says that as a FOO she just hung around, shot the shit, and smoked cigarettes, Goddard took a French course. But Reifenstein's favorite Nick Goddard story dates back to the late summer and fall of 2003. The Canadian forces were helping fight the fires then devastating the British Columbia interior, and A Battery was bugged out to go. Reifenstein was still a brand new battalion commander. Her husband, Major John Reifenstein, a Patricia, was deployed in Bosnia, and they had 2 youngsters at home. She had a backup plan, of course, but had hoped never to have to use it. She had 36 hours' notice to get it in gear. Her friends and family rose beautifully to the occasion, she says, but as she boarded the bus to Winnipeg, and then the flight to Chase, Reifenstein suffered wrenching doubts about whether she was doing the right thing. She was sitting next to Goddard and found herself speaking frankly. I shouldn't have been sharing so much with a junior officer, she says. But I was worried, Was I doing irreparable harm to my kids? Goddard told her about her own unorthodox, itinerant, and independent upbringing. Don't worry about it, she told her major. My parents left us all the time. I didn't even notice it until I was in my early teens. Reifenstein thought, my God, this fantastic kid, this bright, compassionate kid, was trying to reassure me. And she did. I thought, if my kids turn out half as good, I'll be happy. The last time Sally and Tim Goddard saw their oldest daughter was on January 15th, 2006, Sally's 53rd birthday. Nichola and Jay had come to Calgary for the weekend after a side trip to Wainwright, Alberta, where they suspected she might be posted after the Afghanistan mission. The night before, they'd had a typical Goddard dinner, full of conversation, collegial argument, laughter, and lots of wine. Nick and Jay were leaving the next morning at the crack of dawn for Shiloh. Nichola didn't want her parents coming to see her off. She said, "You're not coming to the crying room," Sally says. I've seen enough people off on these missions. I'm not even going to let Jay come. I can't let my men see me like that." So they hugged her goodbye, and she said, "Don't worry about me," as they do. Jay dropped her off at the building where the other families were gathering to watch the bus leave. "We both preferred it that way," he says, instead of having a long public goodbye. Only afterwards, when Sally discovered that Nick hadn't stripped her bed and thrown the sheets in the washer, unusual for her, did she realize how hard leaving had been for her daughter. She was always incredibly organized, Sally says, and she just wasn't then. "I found stuff all over the place, so it was very difficult for her to leave. I think she was upset it would be a while before we'd see her." The Goddards soon joined the nervous society of parents and spouses across the country who started watching television and surfing the web with an edgy keenness and who fell asleep with an ear for the phone. Her parents got a portable one for the bedroom so that when Nichola called, whatever time it was, they wouldn't sleep through it. "The first 2 months," Sally said, "it was okay. We could handle this. Then as things become more tense, we became more tense. You're watching the news saying, 'Thank God it's not my child. She made it through another one.' And then you feel guilty for feeling that, and you watch the repatriation ceremonies, sort of with respect, but with this feeling at the back of your head. Thank God it's not mine." Part of the reason Nichola chose RMC, Sally says, was born in her fierce independence. She didn't want Tim and I to pay for her education. It was her parents who threw RMC into the mix. And on Saturday, after Nick graduated from grade 12 at John Hugh Gillis High School in Antigonish, Nova Scotia, where the family was then living, they drove their oldest daughter to Sydney, where she caught the plane to Kingston. The army wasn't something Nichola always dreamed of, her sister Victoria says, but it appealed to many sides of her: the academic, the athletic, and the community service. Nick also applied to Trent University, where their mother had gone, but as it turned out, she liked the army, and liked it immediately. "She went away to summer basic training camp," says Victoria. "She complained a lot, but she really liked it too. You'd have to sit in a corner for 4 hours if you came out of a room in the wrong direction," Victoria says, "but she really understood the point. This is teaching me things." Nichola was a little afraid of heights. She didn't like insects and was worried about squealing like a little girl if she saw one of Afghanistan's infamous camel spiders, which, seeking the shade, follow your shadow as you walk, like an 8-legged stalker. But Victoria says, "I don't think Nichola has ever been afraid for herself." The Goddard children are the bold and adventurous products of bold and adventurous parents. Sally met Tim when they briefly taught at the same school in Papua New Guinea. Her contract with Canadian University Services overseas expired 6 months after Tim arrived, and she returned to Trent University in Peterborough, Ontario. Tim wrote and phoned that Christmas, and soon sent her a one-way plane ticket to join him. Because she didn't have a job this time, the only way she could re-enter Papua New Guinea was if Tim agreed to marry her, or send her back within 3 months. Sally's father paid for the return portion of the ticket. "He didn't want me to make a decision based on a plane ticket," she says, and she went back. The couple was married in July 1977 and stayed until 1984, spending 2 years living without electricity or running water, with Nichola as their entertainment, as Sally puts it. The little girl spent her days barefoot and dirty, and Sally would take her down to the river for a bath. She remembers Nick holding onto my braids and sucking her thumb, and later watching her daughter as she stared intently at her first flush toilet. She had never worn shoes, Sally says, never even seen shoes. The family, which now included Victoria, returned to Canada when Nichola was 4. First to Sault Ste. Marie, then a stint each in Black Lake and Dundurn, Saskatchewan, the province where their youngest daughter, Kate, was born. They then packed up and moved to Baffin Island in what is now Nunavut. They stayed there almost a year before heading back to Saskatchewan, then Edmonton, then Antigonish, and finally to Calgary in 1999. There, Tim is an associate dean in the Faculty of Education at the University of Calgary. Sally has a couple of temporary jobs with the Calgary Board of Education and still works at Onion Lake First Nations, north of Lloydminster, Alberta. So it was an exotic childhood and adolescence with parents who were curious, engaged in the world, and had strong, informed opinions. Despite the crapshoot that parenting is in the end, it is no surprise that the Goddard girls grew to have an appetite for travel, a thirst for knowledge, and a love for adventure, tempered by a wide streak of responsibility. Kate, just 16 when her sister was killed, was then studying in France on an exchange program. Victoria was 23, had just spent 3 months in Europe studying French and Italian and had popped over to Wales to visit her grandmother. When Sally says of Nichola, I think, in a sense, we created that spirit. She means it of all her kids. They've never been afraid to try anything. What she finds most difficult, she says, is that there's no one to be mad at. And there isn't. People ask, aren't you angry? I'm upset because she's no longer here, but she wasn't deliberately targeted. I mean, they prepare them as well as they can. She was well trained, you know. Maybe evil was stronger than good. I don't know. Tim and Sally are convinced, she says, that Nichola would much rather that she die than lose one of her men. Those World War I stories, those guys, they had to believe in what they were doing. And how many feet did they move in a day? 10? At another point, she says, in many ways, it's like the charge of the Light Brigade. They go forward because that's what they do, and I don't think she did it blindly. Victoria says her sister found the military not without creativity, found that being a leader made her think and feel in different ways. While she believes Nick was already firm-minded, being in the military really strengthened her. She thought about what she was doing. The military gives you a way to make meaning out of life. People have always found it glorious and terrifying. I see the modern experience in those terms. We're trying so hard to be inclusive sometimes, we can't make a stand. Now studying at the University of Toronto for her PhD in medieval studies with 2 degrees, a master's in medieval studies and a Bachelor of Humanities, already under her belt, Victoria isn't sure she feels fully informed about the conflict in Afghanistan. But I know Nick did, she says. I didn't think we should go, she says, but once we go, I support them. This particular mission, I don't have the answers for it. I don't know however else to go about it. Quite frequently, that's how it happens. You make things messier before you can get back to putting them together. That's a noble thing. It's a very complicated issue. I hope the people in charge are considering the thing that, for me, is extremely important to consider, the motives and ideals behind it. In the end, Victoria says, the Afghanistan mission may come down to what she calls that great philosophical question. Do the ends justify the means? I'm not fully decided. These means can degrade the end if you're not careful. But does it dishonor those who died by leaving? Where Victoria is on sure and familiar ground through her reading and her studies is in the value of principles that are so dearly held they infuse a person's life and even reveal a path. I've studied the classics, she says. I'm a medievalist. Most of great literature is about the nobility of the warrior. We need people who will fight to the death for things. It's important. I can put Nichola up with people like the Spartans. She belongs in that class. I'd rather it didn't go to waste. Literature, she says, is part of what makes a civilization worth fighting for. Being a medievalist, I know people were fighting against incredible odds to keep literature alive, to keep thinking alive. Rather than fighting for civilization, she hopes to create one. Victoria is writing a book, a fantasy. I'm trying to address big things, she says. There's good and evil, and you can fight it. I find I read old literature, classics from the Middle Ages. People are not different. It gives you insight into what's going on. I believe in this. I will fight for it, and I think the military helps people do that. Nobody likes to take a stand. I'm going to take a stand in this book, she says. It makes me feel richer. Real philosophical conviction shows how wishy-washy and dull life is without that. It makes life really more meaningful. Once you get pushed and decide to take a stand, it changes you. Sometime in late April or early May 2006, Nichola received a message confirming that she was to be posted to Wainwright at the end of the tour. The day before her death, Beam began the process of getting pre-approved for a mortgage so they could buy a house. On the morning of May 17th, he was at his computer going through some of the mortgage paperwork. I heard the screen door open, he says, but didn't hear a knock or doorbell. I thought it was someone dropping off some flyers or something, so I went down to the front door to check. Standing there was Liam McGarry, the acting CO of 1RCHA, and a padre. At this point, I had realized what had happened, Beam says. He asked for a minute, let the dogs out, and then let the men in. McGarry broke the news bluntly, as soldiers are trained to do. Liam then left me with the padre, and I called Nick's parents. Sally was at the library doing research. Tim was home, but on the phone. Beam left a message, and in a few minutes, Tim called back. You talk about tough jobs you have to do in your life, Sally says. That must have been right up there to tell somebody that their daughter's been killed. Sergeant Dave Redford, Goddard's FOO tech in Kandahar, was in Canada on leave. Beam had the presence of mind to remember. He had the Padre call him. Then Tim Havman arrived. For almost a year, in 2005, Tim and his wife Lisa, both artillery officers, lived right across the street from Jay and Nichola. Havman himself was slated to deploy with Goddard, but after years of being mysteriously ill and malnourished, he was belatedly diagnosed with celiac disease, a chronic condition in which the enzymes needed to digest food are blocked. Despite trying every diet he could find, he wasn't able to declare himself operationally fit because he couldn't eat the rations. And if he couldn't eat the rations, he, like Beam, didn't meet the universality of service requirement. He too will be given a medical release. Because he and Goddard were in the same unit, he knew her better than he knew Jay. Once, when she couldn't get a new beret to shape properly, she walked across the street to my house to ask me to help her. He ended up giving her his spare one. She looked great in it, Havman says, and I was proud that my beret was now hers. A soldier's headdress is perhaps the most important part of his or her uniform. More tellingly, on that awful day in the fall of 2005, when Havman had to face the fact that he wasn't going to be able to deploy, Goddard had helped. If I wasn't sure that I could function at my prime in the worst of situations, then I was not going to potentially put the lives of others in danger or do further harm to my already damaged body. He had to tell Steve Gallagher, the battery commander. I could see the disappointment in his eyes, he says, and that made it hard. Afterwards, he was sitting in his office, crushed, when Goddard came to see him. I remember her sitting across my desk and me telling her how brokenhearted I was about the whole situation, and the fact that I wouldn't be able to do the job that I was trained for. I felt like I was letting everyone down. I remember tears welling up in my eyes. Nichola was listening to my every word, and I could see in her face that she understood. She had tears in her eyes. Gallagher quickly named Havman as the home front officer for the regiment, and he got to work. He had a real understanding of the families back home, because for a time, he was one of them. Lisa deployed to Afghanistan in July 2005. He was the only man at the first meeting of the Military Wives Sisterhood. He also learned about assisting officer job, hoping he would never be called upon to open his big binder. On May 17th, he was, and found himself at J. Beam's house on the Packway, his old street in Shiloh. There they were, two young men of 26, both with military wives, both with two dogs, both betrayed by their bodies such that one was already an ex-soldier and the other about to become one. But for all that, they barely knew one another. I knew he was a nice person, Havman says, loyal to his wife, good with computers, was very intelligent, and had a quiet, keen sense of humor. When he walked in, Beam was on the couch, obviously upset, tears in his eyes, but he gave Havman a smile. I gave him a hug and said, "I'm sorry, Jay." Beam asked for a little time alone to think and make some calls. He phoned his own family, sent out a group email to some friends, had a shower, and then turned on CBC and began recording their broadcast, a tape he still hasn't watched. Within a couple of hours, reporters started phoning. Havman kept track and says that more than 30 called, only one of whom offered condolences. But I think that Jay felt he had a duty to talk to the media so he could share information with the many people who cared about Nichola's death. Jay was by far the strongest and most selfless person involved in the event. He never focused only on himself, and always thought about others. It wasn't until the next morning, Beam says, that the impact really hit him. I was expecting a fax to arrive first thing, more mortgage stuff. I was in bed when the fax machine started ringing. I jumped out of bed so I could watch the machine print off the pages. I went over to my computer to see if I had an email from Nick. They would often arrive overnight due to the difference in time zones. I opened my inbox and saw it was flooded with messages of condolence. It was at this point I realized that it wasn't just a bad dream, and I collapsed to the floor in tears. Major Reifenstein had been on email with Goddard on May 16th, talking about just stuff that I would get. Goddard had reached the point in the tour, as everyone does at some stage, where the novelty is worn off, and the enforced intimacy of living with her crew in one another's pockets was not wholly enchanting. As Reifenstein remembers of her own years as an FOO, You spend an awful lot of time together. You know what Buddy's wife makes as a tattoo artist. You know about their lives with their wives. You end up knowing intimate details. And they have the same level of intimate detail about my life. It's an interesting dynamic, and while everyone pitches in, you're still the boss. It isn't all sunshine and roses. So they had talked about that sort of thing. When Dave Poss phoned from Shiloh and delivered the bad news straight out, as there's no other way, Reifenstein says, she told him there was a mistake because I'd just been on email with her the day before. It was as if a member of her family had died, she says. I had the shock, numbness, and just an overwhelming feeling of grief strike me. I wept and wept. Normally, hormones aside, I'm not much of a weeper. She went right away to tell Captain Sonny Hatton, another officer who was in A Battery with Goddard. Many months later, Hatton told her he was in the grocery store and bought Brussels sprouts because they reminded him of Nick. He hates them, Reifenstein says, and his wife hates them, but Nichola loved them and would serve them every time she had Jay and Sonny and Chantal over for dinner in Shiloh. Reifenstein remembers how instantly the press played up the first woman angle. Goddard was the first Canadian woman to die in combat since Korea, the first female FOO to be killed in action. She understood it, but was so overwhelmed with the need to ensure that people understood that Nick was so much more than just some poor girl who managed to be the first one to die that she responded to the reporters who called her. It was graduation time at RMC, a busy time, and Reifenstein was struggling through the work when she got an email from an officer cadet who had been issued Goddard's pillbox hat. It had Nichola's last name and service number in it, she says, and she offered it to me instead of returning it to the RMC stores where college tradition sees the hats reissued. The young woman thought Reifenstein would know what to do with it. But she wasn't sure, really, until her husband said it would be a good thing to offer to the family at the repatriation ceremony in Trenton. She checked with the escort officer and ended up giving it to Kate. Her family's response was amazing, she says. They welcomed me into their circle of grieving as they welcomed everyone, and which in my mind gave me the right to grieve for the loss of their wife and daughter. She went to as many ceremonies as she could, including the funeral in Calgary and the interment in Ottawa, and has returned to that headstone since, wishing desperately she wasn't there. Before Reifenstein left Shiloh in 2005, Goddard gave her a letter and a gift, which she warned was fairly touchy-feely and that I should know she meant it. I read it and teared up. Damn it, I did not want to leave her and the others in my battery behind, but I sucked it up and did a polite take care to all and left it at that, to my everlasting shame. No touchy-feely shit for me. The gift was a copy of Anne of Green Gables, the classic novel by Lucy Maud Montgomery, and this is what Nichola Goddard wrote. Ma'am, as one can never have too many books, I wanted to share Anne Shirley's story with you. Anne Shirley is an orphan who spends the majority of her life being moved between foster homes and generally trying to fit in. She is constantly accused of not being a boy. Anne makes no apologies about her behavior and mixes tomboy stunts with purely feminine concerns about her hair and nose. Throughout the whole story, Anne only once regrets that she was not a boy. At that time, Matthew says, I'd rather have you than a dozen boys. Anne has earned her place and proven her worth to all she has met. I wanted to give you this story to thank you for all the guidance and professional development that you have given me. Most of all, I want to thank you for showing me that there is nothing to regret about being female and being a combat arms officer. You have allowed me to develop my leadership abilities while being proud of my gender. You have caused me to view being a woman as an asset, not a detriment to the team or to my profession. I can only hope to inspire other women to persevere and take pride in their accomplishments as much as you have for me. Thank you, Nichola. I think, Reifenstein says, that sums it up nicely. Mix in the boy stuff, keep some girl stuff, including a few neuroses, and then forget about all of it and get the job done. In the fall of 2006, A Battery of 1 RCHA held a memorial for their fallen friend. In her memory, with Jay Beam and Sally and Tim Goddard present, her comrades dedicated a trig marker to her. A trig marker is used as a survey point and is thus a permanent fixture of the landscape. Like Goddard herself, the marker is both practical and reflective, useful in orientation and navigation, but also designed to act as a point on the soldier's moral compass, meant to help us keep doing what is right and good, as the description in the unit's official press release reads. The important thing to remember is the story, Reifenstein says. She mentions a soldier who died in 1991, then says, Every year, a friend in the mess rings the bell on the date of his death. So 10, 15 years after, kids who weren't even in high school before they could imagine life as a soldier raise a glass in his memory. At the memorial for Goddard, the guns fired 5 rounds of fire for effect in the artillery's traditional salute. Goddard's FOO party from Kandahar actually called in the mission. Nichola Goddard left an "in the event of my death" note, her mother says. She had often held these notes for other soldiers. In it, she said how much she loved Jay, us, Victoria, and Kate. She also said to tell Sergeant Redford, who was on leave, "I didn't mean to leave the charge, but sometimes it happens. Strength and honor, Nick." It's a funny thing, that strength and honor business. Her parents had heard Nichola say it often enough that it now adorns a plaque they had laid in their daughter's memory in the churchyard on Remembrance Day 2006. Sally assumed it was a military motto or from RMC, but it isn't, and neither is it a motto of any unit in the Canadian Forces. Jay found it only on a t-shirt he received after Nichola's death, and a package of gifts she'd bought for her friends at the American PX on CAF. It was a US unit's shirt, he says, but he can't remember which one. The only intact reference I could find is in the Bible, Proverbs 31:25, in a section that can loosely be characterized as instructions on being a good wife and woman. The quote in its entirety, and it changes depending on the version of the Bible, with honor sometimes replaced by dignity, reads, "Strength and honor are her clothing, and she laughs at the time to come." The mystery is solved finally by Ian Hope, in whose company Goddard spent so much time. "It was indeed my mantra to Task Force Orion," he says. "I used to sum up my little preaching sessions with strength and honor, so Nick would have heard it a few times from me." Familiar to many from the 2000 Academy Award-winning war movie Gladiator, in which the words were spoken by the fictional Roman general Maximus, played by Russell Crowe, Hope says, the writers of that script borrowed it from a Roman motto of a fighting legion long ago since lost in history. The phrase appears on the reverse of the Orion coin, Robustus et Fortis. So that's where it came from, though I still like the idea of Nichola Goddard laughing at the time to come. A big thank you to the family for giving permission for me to do this reading and this episode, and I've also included a link in the show notes to the Captain Nichola Goddard Fund, which provides national funding to directly benefit community programs that support service women, veteran women, and their families, which help address the unique challenges related to military life. The fund is administered by the True Patriot Love Foundation in partnership with the Goddard family. I apologize if I've mispronounced any names that were included in this reading. Thank you for listening. If you'd like to help support this podcast, please subscribe and leave a rating and review on your Apple Podcast app.